After losing his wife and seeing his son paralyzed, a father hides behind cameras and cutting-edge treatments. Nothing breaks the child's silence until a caregiver appears, offering no promises, only presence. With soft songs, gentle stories, and attentive eyes, she builds a bridge that even science could not reach. And in that delicate crossing, one word pierces the emptiness: Father. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We continue. The low mist of the Blue Ridge Mountains embraced the Alcott mansion like a ghostly veil. In Aspen Grove, the imposing estate stood out among the pine trees as a monument to wealth and power. In the office, paneled with noble wood, Edward Alcott, a real estate mogul and one of New York City's most influential men, buried himself in documents. "I need to be in Washington, D.C. early tomorrow," Edward murmured to his assistant over the phone as he adjusted his tie in front of the Venetian mirror. "After that, I'll head to the United Kingdom. The deal with the European investors can't wait." Anne, his assistant for over 15 years, hesitated on the other end of the line. "Dr. Edward, tomorrow marks 1 year since Mrs. Helen... Double quotes, silence hung heavy on the line. Edward gripped the phone with unnecessary force. His jaw tightened as he stared at his own reflection in the mirror. "I know what day tomorrow is. Believe me, I know." Upstairs, Louisa Alcott, just 10 years old, carefully adjusted a small candle in front of her mother's framed portrait. The girl with curly brown hair and almond-shaped eyes, inherited from the late Helen, lit the wick and sat on the edge of the bed. The spacious room, decorated in pastel tones, seemed larger and colder since her mother had passed away. "Mum," she whispered to the photograph, "it's been a year tomorrow. Dad's going away again." Soft footsteps echoed down the marble corridor. The door creaked open, revealing Deborah Maxwell, Edward's new wife. At 32, 15 years younger than her husband, Deborah was what society magazines called a stunning beauty. Perfectly straightened blonde hair, prominent cheekbones, and piercing blue eyes. "Louisa, dear," her voice was sweet as honey, "is everything all right?" The girl didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened on the duvet as Deborah entered the room and sat beside her. Her stepmother's strong perfume filled her nostrils, so different from the soft lavender scent her mother used. "I'm just remembering Mum," Louisa finally replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the photograph. Deborah watched the girl for a few moments, before delicately running her fingers through Louisa's curls. "I know it's hard, dear, but life goes on, doesn't it? Your father and I want you to be happy." At that moment, Edward appeared at the door, already wearing his travel coat. "I'm leaving," he announced, glancing briefly at the lit candle. "Will you two be all right?" "Of course, darling." Deborah stood up with a radiant smile. "I'll take care of our little one as if she were my own daughter." Edward approached and kissed Louisa's forehead. "I'll be back in a week, princess. Behave and obey, Deborah." The girl nodded silently. When Edward left, Deborah remained for a few moments, the smile still fixed on her lips. The sound of the BMW engine starting outside was heard, then the crunch of tires on the gravel road leading to the main gate. As soon as the last echo of the car disappeared, Deborah's smile evaporated. Her eyes, once affectionate, hardened as they rested on Helen's photograph. "Put out that candle," she ordered in an unrecognizable voice. "This isn't a church, and this is no place for a sanctuary." Louisa looked at her stepmother, surprised by the sudden change. "But Dad said I could." "Your father isn't here now," Deborah cut in, moving towards the door. "We have rules in this house while he's away." The first is that I don't want this funeral atmosphere. The second is that you're going to start helping with household chores. It's time you learned to contribute." The girl remained motionless, confusion etched on her childlike face. "I'll be in the dining room in 15 minutes, Deborah continued. "I want you to set the table for dinner. Lucy will show you where everything is." When the door closed, Louisa looked again at her mother's portrait, a woman with a gentle smile and eyes identical to her own. Reluctantly, she blew out the candle, leaving a thin wisp of smoke to dance in the air. In the kitchen, Lucy, the housekeeper, who had worked for the Alcarts for over 2 decades, watched little Louisa trying to reach the plates on the high shelf. "Let me get those for you, child," the gray-haired woman offered. "No," Louisa replied, determined. "Deborah said I need to learn." Lucy frowned. "Mrs. Deborah asked you to set the table." The girl nodded, finally reaching a plate. "Strange," Lucy murmured. "Your father never allowed you to do household chores. He always says you should focus on your studies." In the center of the dining table, an arrangement of white daisies glowed under the chandelier's light. They were Helen's favorite flowers, and Edward maintained the tradition of always having them in the house. Louisa delicately touched the petals as she placed the silverware. Deborah entered the room, now wearing a red silk robe. Her gaze immediately fell upon the daisies. "Who put these here?" "They were delivered this morning, Madame," Lucy replied from the kitchen doorway. "Dr. Edward has a monthly subscription with the florist." With a swift movement, Deborah picked up the vase and handed it to the housekeeper. "Take it to the trash. The smell gives me a headache." Louisa watched, petrified, as Lucy, visibly uncomfortable, accepted the vase. "But, Madame, Dr. Edward, always—" "Edward isn't here," Deborah cut in, again using those words as a definitive sentence. "And while he's away, I decide what stays or goes in this house." Dinner proceeded in tense silence. Louisa poked at her grilled salmon without appetite, while Deborah sipped her glass of red wine, observing her stepdaughter with a calculating gaze. "Don't you like the fish?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "I'm not hungry," Louisa murmured. "Well, eat it anyway. I won't tolerate waste in this house." The girl forced herself to swallow a few bites, feeling them go down like stones in her throat. When she finished, she stood up to clear her plate, but Deborah stopped her. "Wait, we're not finished yet." Louisa sat back down, keeping her eyes lowered. "Look at me when I speak to you," Deborah ordered, the gentle tone completely absent now. The girl slowly raised her gaze, meeting her stepmother's cold eyes. "Tomorrow we'll start a new routine around here. No more ridiculous candles, no more crying in corners, no more staring at portraits all day. Understood?" Louisa nodded silently. "I want to hear your answer." "Yes, Deborah." A thin smile formed on the woman's lips. She picked up her wineglass and raised it in a silent toast. "We're going to get along very well in the coming weeks, Louisa. You'll see." Later, alone in her room, Louisa opened the nightstand drawer and took out a small, locked diary. Helen had given it to her on their last birthday together. With a small silver key, the girl opened the notebook and wrote in a trembling hand, "Dear Diary, Dad traveled today. Tomorrow marks 1 year since Mum passed away." Deborah changed as soon as he left through the gate. She ordered the daisies thrown out. "I'm scared of what will happen in the next few days." Outside, dark clouds gathered over the Alcourt mansion, foreshadowing a storm approaching the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it wasn't just the tempest threatening that elegant house among the pine trees of Aspen Grove. The next morning dawned gray in Aspen Grove. A fine, persistent drizzle fogged the windows of the Alcott mansion, giving the property an even more melancholic appearance. Louisa awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway and muffled voices. She sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes, when the door suddenly opened. "It's time to get up," Deborah announced, entering the room without ceremony. She was wearing a branded tracksuit and carrying a list on a clipboard. "We have a lot to do today." Louisa looked at the clock on the nightstand. 6:30 in the morning. On Saturdays, Edward always let her sleep in. "But it's still early," she protested timidly. Deborah ignored the comment, walking to the curtains and opening them with an abrupt movement. The dull light of the cloudy day flooded the room. "Your father spoiled you too much," she declared, turning to face her stepdaughter. "In my house, when I was your age, I woke up at 5 to help my mother before school. That builds character." Louisa sat on the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. The room felt different, and she soon realized why. Her mother's portrait was no longer on the side table. "Where's Mum's picture?" she asked, her heart racing. "I put it away," Deborah replied dryly. "As I said, we're implementing changes around here. The first is to stop living in the past." The girl felt a knot form in her throat. That day, especially, was the anniversary of her mother's passing. She had planned to place fresh flowers in front of the photograph. "But today is—" "I know what day today is," Deborah cut her off, checking her wristwatch. "And that's precisely why we need to move forward. Get dressed and come down for breakfast in 15 minutes. Afterward, Lucy will show you your chore list." When the door closed, Louisa allowed the tears to finally roll. With trembling hands, she opened all the drawers searching for the photograph, but couldn't find it. She sat on the floor, hugging her knees, and allowed herself a moment of silent despair before wiping her face on her pajama sleeve and heading to the bathroom. Downstairs, the breakfast table was set with a simplicity that contrasted with the elaborate meals Edward usually provided. Just a coffee pot, some toast, and a jar of strawberry jam. "Where's the orange juice?" Louisa asked as she sat down. Deborah, who was typing something on her phone, looked up with irritation. "If you want juice, make it yourself. The oranges are in the fridge." Lucy, who was passing by with a stack of towels, paused briefly. "I can prepare the juice for the child, Mrs. Deborah." "No," Deborah replied firmly. "Louisa needs to learn to fend for herself. The world out there isn't going to serve orange juice on a silver platter." Breakfast proceeded in silence. Louisa mechanically chewed a piece of toast without butter, while Deborah remained engrossed in her phone. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the mansion windows. After the meal, Lucy guided Louisa to the kitchen, where a list was affixed to the refrigerator. "Mrs. Deborah left these chores for you," the housekeeper explained, her tone revealing disapproval. "But don't worry, I'll help you however I can." The list was extensive: dust the living room shelves, organize the magazines, water the solarium plants, help fold the clean laundry. Tasks that Edward would never have allowed his daughter to perform. "Why is she doing this, Lucy?" Louisa asked in a low voice as she picked up the duster. The housekeeper looked over her shoulder, making sure Deborah wasn't nearby. "Some people, my dear, can only shine by dimming the light of others," she replied enigmatically. "But don't worry, your father will be back soon." The morning dragged on slowly. While Louisa dusted the living room furniture, Deborah remained seated on the sofa, watching a television program and occasionally making disparaging comments about the girl's work. "You didn't clean properly there." She pointed to a corner of the shelf. "Go back and do it again." When Louisa finished the living room tasks, she was directed to the solarium, a spacious room with glass walls and ceiling, filled with exotic plants that Helen lovingly cultivated. Since her mother's passing, Edward had hired a gardener who came twice a week to care for the small paradise Helen had created. Now, apparently, it would be Louisa's responsibility. "Water each of them, but be careful with the amount of water," instructed Deborah, who had followed her to the solarium. "If any die because of you, your father will be very disappointed." Louisa picked up the watering can and began the task. In the center of the solarium, an arrangement of white daisies, similar to the one Deborah had ordered thrown out the day before, stood out among the foliage. They were Helen's favorites. "I thought I had ordered these flowers thrown out," Deborah commented, approaching the arrangement. "These are from the garden, madame," Louisa replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mum planted them personally." A cold smile formed on Deborah's lips. "Well, now I am the lady of this house, and I don't like daisies." With a deliberate movement, she tipped over the vase, spilling soil and flowers across the solarium's marble floor. "Clean that up," she ordered, turning to leave. Louisa stood paralyzed, watching the delicate white flowers mingle with the damp soil. A single daisy remained intact, as if defying the destruction around it. The girl knelt and began to collect the shards of the vase when she felt a sharp pain. A fragment had cut her finger. A drop of blood dripped onto the surviving daisy, staining its white petals. "Be careful with those shards," Deborah commented, watching from the doorway. "Cracks don't heal easily." During lunch, Deborah seemed strangely pleased with herself. She poured herself a generous amount of wine, while Louisa merely picked at the food on her plate. "Aren't you going to eat?" Deborah asked, raising an eyebrow. "Wasting food is a terrible habit." "I'm not hungry," Louisa murmured. "Very well, then don't eat. But there will be no afternoon snack for you." The afternoon followed the same rhythm as the morning. More chores, more criticism, more small cruelties disguised as life lessons. When she finally finished folding the towels in the laundry room, Louisa silently went up to her room, hoping to find some refuge. To her surprise, the door was ajar. She was sure she had closed it when she left that morning. She entered cautiously and immediately realized something was wrong. Her drawers were open and several items were out of place. "Looking for this?" Deborah's voice came from the armchair in the corner of the room. She was leafing through Louisa's diary, the one Helen had given her, and where the girl recorded her most intimate thoughts. "That's mine," Louisa exclaimed, stepping forward to retrieve the notebook. Deborah snapped it shut and held it out of the girl's reach. "Nothing in this house is truly yours, you know. Everything belongs to your father, and by extension, to me as well." Louisa felt tears stinging her eyes, but refused to cry in front of her stepmother. "Please, give it back. Mum gave it to me." Something dark glinted in Deborah's eyes. "Helen, Helen, Helen, is that all you ever think about? She's gone, forever. And guess what else? Your father has already moved on. Why don't you do the same?" With a fluid movement, Deborah stood up and walked to the decorative fireplace in the corner of the room. Before Louisa could react, she opened the small compartment where the heater controls were and threw the diary inside. "No," Louisa cried, running to retrieve it, but it was too late. Deborah closed the compartment and turned the key. "Oops," she smiled, putting the key in her pocket. "Looks like you'll have to start a new diary. One without mentions of Helen on every page." The girl stared at her stepmother, an unknown feeling growing in her chest, something between anger and determination. "My father will know about this when he gets back," she said with a firmness that surprised both of them. Deborah's smile wavered for an instant, but soon returned, more calculating. "Who will your father believe? His adult wife, or the problematic child who can't get over her mother's loss. She approached, leaning down until she was face to face with Louisa. Besides, he doesn't even answer my calls. He's too busy with his business to worry about what happens here. At that moment, as if to confirm her words, Louisa's phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a message from Edward. Meeting ran long, Princess. We won't be able to do our video call today. We'll talk tomorrow. Love you. Deborah, who had read the message over Louisa's shoulder, smiled triumphantly. See, it's always been like this, hasn't it? Even when Helen was alive, Edward Orcott always puts business first. Louisa put away the phone, refusing to give her stepmother the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. He cares about me, she stated with conviction. Deborah laughed, a cold sound that echoed through the room. Of course he does. That's why he left you here with me, knowing what kind of person I really am. That night, after everyone had retired, Louisa sat by her bedroom window, watching the rain continue to fall mercilessly over Aspen Grove. In her hand, a single petal from the daisy that had survived the destruction in the solarium. A small fragment of resistance she had kept in her pocket. "Mum," she whispered into the night, "I'm trying to be strong, but it's hard without you here." Outside, a lightning bolt cut across the sky, momentarily illuminating the muddy garden. For an instant, Louisa thought she saw a figure in the rain, watching the mansion. But when she blinked, there was nothing but darkness and the storm lashing at the Alcott's windows. In Washington, D.C., Edward Orcott participated in a tense meeting with representatives from the Department of Infrastructure. As one of the country's largest real estate developers, his presence was fundamental to discuss new projects that would transform the coastal region of New York City. Beside him, advisors presented charts and projections, while he signed documents without really paying attention to what he was reading. "Mr. Orcott?" The voice of the executive secretary of the department brought him back to reality. "Do you agree with the terms?" Edward blinked twice, as if waking from a trance. Through the meeting room window, the National Mall was visible under an impeccably blue sky, so different from the overcast weather he had left. Behind an aspen grove. "Pardon me," he said, adjusting his tie. "Could you repeat the last clause?" His chief advisor, Robert, gave him a worried look. It was rare to see the always focused Edward Orcott distracted during negotiations. As the secretary repeated the information, Edward discreetly took out his phone under the table. No missed calls from Deborah, just a message stating that everything was fine. He opened his photo gallery and scrolled until he found an image of Louisa smiling, taken months before. That smile had gradually faded since Helen's passing. An uncomfortable feeling grew in his chest, something between guilt and unease. Today marked exactly 1 year since Helen had left them after a silent battle against a cerebral aneurysm that no one saw coming. A year in which he had immersed himself in work to avoid facing the emptiness, while his daughter dealt with the pain alone. "Mr. Orcott?" The secretary's voice sounded again, now with a hint of irritation. Edward put away his phone and straightened up in his chair. "Gentlemen, I apologize, but we need to reschedule this meeting," he announced, to the surprise of everyone present. "A family emergency has arisen that cannot wait." Robert's eyes widened, but he quickly took control of the situation, negotiating a new date while Edward gathered his documents. 20 minutes later, in the car on the way to the airport, Robert finally questioned, "Edward, the British are arriving tomorrow. We have the contract signing on Monday. What happened?" "Today marks 1 year since Helen passed away," Edward replied, looking out the car window. "And I left my daughter with a woman we barely know. Deborah?" Robert frowned. "You've been married for almost 6 months." "Exactly." 6 months. Edward turned to face his friend. "Helen and I were together for 15 years. I knew every expression, every thought of hers. With Deborah ... double quotes. He hesitated. "With Deborah, sometimes I feel like I'm living with a stranger." At Washington, D.C. airport, Edward managed to get a private flight to New York City. Throughout the journey, he tried to call the mansion in Aspen Grove, but no one answered. He called Louisa's cell phone several times, always going straight to voicemail. When the plane landed at LaGuardia, anxiety was already consuming him. Ignoring the driver who was waiting for him, he rented a car and drove personally along Interstate 81 towards the Blue Ridge Mountains, exceeding the speed limit for most of the journey. The persistent rain made the road to Aspen Grove dangerously slippery, but Edward barely noticed. In his mind, images of Louisa alternated with memories of Helen. He remembered the last time he had seen his wife alive. She was in the solarium, tending to her daisies, when she suddenly put her hand to her head and collapsed. Immediate help was not enough. It was almost dawn when Edwardska finally crossed the mansion gates. The rain had paused, and the sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon. The house was dark, except for a single light on the lower floor. Using his key, Edward entered silently. The smell of red wine hung in the air, along with another aroma he couldn't identify. On the entrance hall floor, he noticed recent scratches on the noble wood flooring, and fragments of what appeared to be glass, hastily swept into a corner. "Louisa?" he called softly, not wanting to wake the whole house. No response. He went up the stairs carefully, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. In the second-floor hallway, he went directly to his daughter's room and turned the doorknob. Locked. Strange. Louisa never locked her door. "Louisa?" he called again, now tapping lightly. "Princess, it's Dad. Open the door." Silence. A shiver ran down his spine. Edward knocked harder, calling for his daughter with growing concern. When no answer came, he stepped back a few paces and, with a decisive movement, charged against the door. The locker gave way with a snap, and the door swung open. The room was empty. The bed was made, as if no one had slept in it, the window closed, the curtains motionless. "Louisa!" Now Edward was shouting, panic growing in his chest. A muffled sound caught his attention. It came from somewhere downstairs. Edward ran down the stairs, almost stumbling on the last steps. He followed the sound to the basement, where the old wine cellar that Helen had transformed into a storage area for gardening supplies was located. The basement door was ajar, a sliver of light escaping through it. Edward pushed it open slowly. "Louisa!" A faint sob answered his call. In the farthest corner of the basement, huddled among dusty boxes, was his daughter. Her curly hair was disheveled, her face streaked with dry tears, and her hands, Edward noticed with horror, were cold and scratched. "Dad," she murmured, as if she couldn't believe he was actually there. Edward ran to her, taking her in his arms. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Louisa trembled, clinging to her father's shirt, as if she feared he would disappear. She locked me in here, ... double quotes, she stammered between sobs. "After she broke Mum's portrait ... not who?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "Deborah," Louisa replied, finally looking into her father's eyes. "She changed when you left. She threw away the daisies, made me work all day, broke the vase in the solarium, and ... double quotes Louisa couldn't
Instead,
finish. She opened her trembling hand, revealing a crumpled piece of photographic paper, a fragment of Helen's portrait that had once adorned her room. Edward's blood boiled in his veins. Carefully, he helped his daughter up and guided her out of the basement, ascending the stairs towards the master bedroom. In the second-floor hallway, the bedroom door opened, and Deborah appeared wearing a silk robe. Her eyes widened when she saw Edward. "Darling, what a wonderful surprise!" she exclaimed, trying to kiss him. "We weren't expecting you so soon." Edward recoiled, his gaze fixed on his wife's eyes. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice dangerously controlled. Deborah looked at Louisa, who cowered behind her father, and her face took on an expression of false concern. "What are you talking about? Louisa, what have you been telling your father?" Edward positioned himself protectively in front of his daughter. "Don't address her. I'm asking you, why was my daughter locked in the basement?" For a moment, Deborah seemed genuinely confused. Then her expression changed to something calculating. "Edward, darling, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Louisa has been so difficult since you left. She refuses to follow basic rules, responds rudely, broke Helen's portrait in a fit of rage, ... liar." Louisa cried, stepping out from behind her father. "You broke the portrait. You locked me downstairs because I tried to pick up the pieces." Deborah laughed, a cold, controlled sound. "See how she is, hysterical, making up stories. Consult Dr. Mitchell. He recommended we leave her in a quiet environment when she has these episodes. She's been exhibiting concerning behaviors, Edward. I think the anniversary of Helen's passing has affected her more than we imagined." Edward looked from his wife to his daughter, noticing the genuine fear in the child's eyes and something disturbing in Deborah's confident posture. "Louisa," he said softly, "go to my office and wait there." "But Dad, now, Princess, please." Reluctantly, the girl obeyed, casting one last frightened glance at her stepmother before descending the stairs. As soon as he heard the office door close, Edward turned to Deborah. All pretense of calm evaporated. "It's over," he declared. "I want you out of this house by dawn." Deborah blinked, her mask of control wavering for an instant. "What are you talking about? You can't possibly be believing the fantasies of a disturbed child." Edward took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I saw the scratches on the floor. I saw the broken glass someone tried to hide. I saw the state of my daughter. And most importantly, he took out the fragment of the photograph Louisa had given him from his pocket. I saw this, the mark of your heel on Helen's face." Deborah stood motionless for a moment. Then a cold smile formed on her lips. "She was always between us, wasn't she? Even gone, Helen never truly left us." She took a step forward, her eyes gleaming with something Edward didn't recognize. "I could have been a good wife to you, Edward. We could have built something new without ghosts. Get out of my house," Edward repeated, his voice trembling with contained rage. "Take your things and leave. My lawyer will contact you about the divorce." Deborah recoiled, her face hardening. "You'll regret this," she whispered, before turning and entering the bedroom, slamming the door. Edward remained in the hallway for a moment, breathing deeply to control the fury that threatened to overwhelm him. Then he went down the stairs towards the office, where he found Louisa huddled in the leather armchair, hugging her knees. "Is she leaving?" the girl asked in a low voice. Edward knelt before his daughter, taking her small scratched hands in his. "Yes, Princess. She'll never hurt you again, I promise." Louisa looked at her father, years of hurt and pain reflected in her childlike eyes. "Are you going to travel again?" The question hit Edward like a punch. How many times had he left, leaving his daughter behind, immersing himself in work to escape his own pain? "No," he replied, with a firmness that surprised both of them. "I'm not going anywhere without you. Upstairs." Sounds of Deborah packing her things could be heard, sometimes dropping objects with unnecessary force. Edward hugged his daughter, shielding her from the sound of the fury of the woman who, through a terrible error in judgment, he had brought into their lives. Outside, the rain began again, drumming against the Alcott's mansion windows. But for the first time in a long time, father and daughter were no longer alone in their grief. The sun was barely beginning to peek over the pine trees of Aspen Grove when Edward accompanied Deborah to the mansion door. She carried only 2 designer suitcases, leaving behind clothes and accessories that would easily fill a small apartment. Her face, perfectly made up even at that hour, showed no emotion, just a calculating coldness that Edward now clearly recognized. "My lawyer will contact you about your belongings," he said, holding the door open. "And about the terms of the divorce." Deborah adjusted her sunglasses, hiding her eyes. "You have no idea what you've just started, Edward," she replied with a disturbing calm. "No one humiliates Deborah Maxwell with impunity. And is that a threat?" Edward kept his voice low, aware that Louisa might hear from upstairs. A thin smile formed on the woman's lips. "Just a statement. We'll see how the powerful Edward Alcott deals with public opinion when they discover what kind of man you really are." Without waiting for a reply, she walked to the Porsche convertible, parked at the entrance. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, promising more storm. Edward watched as the car disappeared through the property gate, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. Returning inside, he found Lucy in the kitchen, preparing hot chocolate. "You did the right thing," the housekeeper commented, handing him a steaming cup. "From the start, I knew she wasn't what she seemed." Edward sighed, sitting on the kitchen island stool. "How didn't I notice, Lucy? How could I have been so blind?" The gray-haired woman gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "You were vulnerable, Dr. Edward. Loneliness does that to people. It makes us desperate for company, even if it's the wrong kind." At that moment, Louisa appeared at the kitchen door, still in pajamas. Her hands were bandaged. Edward had treated the cuts and scratches the night before. "Has she left?" the girl asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Yes, Princess," Edward confirmed, opening his arms. Louisa ran into her father's embrace, and, for a few minutes, they stayed like that. A father rediscovering his daughter, a daughter rediscovering safety. "What are we going to do today?" Louisa finally asked, pulling back to look at her father. Edward smiled, brushing a rebellious curl from his daughter's face. "Whatever you want. The day is ours." After breakfast, Edward cancelled all his meetings for the week. He called Robert, briefly explaining the situation and asking him to reorganize his schedule. The British investors would have to wait. His daughter came first now. The morning passed peacefully. Father and daughter strolled through the property's garden, observing the damage caused by the heavy rain of the past few days. In the solarium, Edward listened with growing indignation to Louisa's full account of her days under Deborah's care. The humiliations, the forced chores, the destruction of the daisy vase. "I'm so sorry, Princess," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I should never have left you alone with her." Louisa squeezed her father's hand. "You didn't know, Dad, but I should have known," Edward insisted. "I promise I will never neglect you like this again." In the early afternoon, while they prepared a simple lunch together, Edward was a terrible cook. which drew Louisa's first genuine laughs in months. The phone rang. It was Robert, and by the tone of his voice, something was wrong. "Edward, you need to see what's circulating on social media," his friend said without preamble. "What are you talking about?" "Deborah. She posted a video about an hour ago accusing you of aggression and of having kicked her out of the house. It's going viral." Edward's blood ran cold. Excusing himself from Louisa, who was now trying to save the omelette he had let burn, he went to the office and opened his laptop. He didn't have to look far. The video was the first item in his news feeds. On screen, a visibly distraught Deborah, with makeup smeared by tears, spoke directly to the camera. The background was clearly the gate of the Alcott mansion. "I am making this video for my own safety," she said, her voice trembling. "I have just been thrown out of my own home by my husband, Edward Alcott." Edward watched in horror as Deborah narrated a completely distorted version of events, how he supposedly mistreated her, how he was cruel to his own daughter, how he blamed her for everything that went wrong in his life. "He came back from his trip early this morning completely out of his mind," Deborah continued in the video. "He accused me of terrible things, and ... double quotes. Her voice theatrically faltered. "I fear what he might do to little Louisa. Someone needs to intervene before it's too late." The video had strategic cuts, dramatic pauses, close-ups on carefully shed tears. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, directed by someone who clearly understood the power of social media. Robert was still on the line. "Edward, this is exploding. Journalists are already calling the office wanting your version. What do we do?" Before Edward could respond, he heard the sound of cars approaching on the gravel driveway. He quickly went to the office window and saw 3 TV station vans parking by the mansion gate. "Damn it," he murmured. "Robert, call Dr. Davies. Tell him I need legal guidance immediately. And ask him to contact Dr. Laurel as well. We'll need a family law specialist." He hung up the phone and quickly returned to the kitchen, where Louisa was still struggling with the charred omelette. "Princess," he called, trying to keep his voice calm. "We need to go upstairs. Let's leave the kitchen for later, okay?" The girl noticed the change in her father's tone. Did something happen? Before Edward could answer, the doorbell rang insistently. Through the living room windows, they saw reporters crowding at the gate, some trying to climb the fence to get better angles of the property. "What do they want?" Louisa asked, fear returning to her eyes. Edward took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. How to explain to a 10-year-old child that her ex-stepmother was using the media as a weapon of revenge? "Deborah is saying things that aren't true about us, Princess," he explained carefully. "These reporters want to know if what she said is real." Louisa looked out the window, observing the growing number of cameras and microphones. "Why is she lying, Dad?" Edward knelt to be at his daughter's eye level. "Some people, when they feel hurt or rejected, do bad things to hurt others. But don't worry. The truth always prevails in the end." The house phone began to ring incessantly. Edward disconnected the device and checked his cell phone. Dozens of missed calls and messages from journalists, colleagues, even old friends wanting to know his side of the story. As they closed the first-floor curtains, the gate intercom rang. It was Dr. Davies, Edward's trusted lawyer for over a decade. Edward authorized his entry, instructing the security guard not to allow anyone else past the gates. "This is a circus," the lawyer commented as he entered, taking off his coat wet from the drizzle that had restarted. "There are at least 5 broadcasters out there, and Deborah's video has already been shown on the main midday newscasts. Edward led the lawyer to the office, asking Lucy to stay with Louisa in the upstairs playroom. "What's the extent of the damage, Oscar?" he asked as soon as they closed the door. Dr. Davies, a thin, middle-aged man with graying hair at his temples, adjusted his thin-rimmed glasses. "Significant, but manageable. Deborah accuses you of emotional abuse, expulsion from the marital home, parental neglect. But there are no formal criminal charges. Yet. Yet?" The lawyer sighed, sitting in the leather armchair. "Edward, I know Deborah
Before
Maxwell
marrying
from
you,
other cases. She was already involved in similar disputes with ex-partners. She has a history of manipulation and retaliation when things don't go her way." Edward passed his hand through his hair, frustrated. "Why didn't you warn me when I married her?" "Professional ethics," Oscar simply replied. "I couldn't comment on previous cases, but now that we're on the same side, I can use that knowledge to help you." The intercom rang again. It was Dr. Laurel, a family law specialist. The afternoon dragged on with legal discussions. The lawyers agreed that the most sensible strategy would be official silence for now, until they fully understood Deborah's intentions. Edward agreed, though reluctantly. He wanted to defend himself publicly, to clear his name. "Haste is the enemy of effective strategy," argued Dr. Laurel, an assertive woman in her 50s. "If we respond impulsively, we'll give her exactly what she wants. More attention, more drama, more ammunition." As they talked, the number of press vehicles outside only increased. Flashes fired incessantly, illuminating the windows even through the closed curtains. Reporters shouted questions through the intercom, hoping someone would eventually answer. Outside, the rain intensified again, but this did not deter the journalists. The story was too juicy. The powerful businessman, Edward Orcott, known for his discretion and impeccable reputation, accused by his young wife of abusive behavior. Upstairs, Louisa watched the commotion from her bedroom window, the lights of the flashes reflecting on her pale face. Lucy tried to distract her with board games, but the girl was visibly disturbed by the invasion. When Edward finally went up to see her, it was already night. The lawyers had left through the back of the property to avoid the reporters, leaving a detailed action plan. He found Louisa sitting on the bed, hugging the teddy bear Helen had given her for her last birthday. "They're still there, Dad," the girl commented, without taking her eyes off the window. Edward sat beside her, gently pulling the curtains to block the view of the lights and cameras. "I know it's scary, Princess, but it will pass. Remember what I said about the truth." Louisa nodded, hugging the bear tighter against her chest. "That it always wins in the end." "Exactly." Edward smiled, kissing the top of his daughter's head. "Now we need to be patient and strong. Can we do this?" "We can," Louisa replied, trying hard to seem brave, though her eyes betrayed her fear. That night, while Louisa finally slept, Edward remained awake in his office, browsing news websites. The story was gaining alarming proportions. Commentators gave opinions, specialists analyzed the case, and Deborah's video, now with over 1 million views, was dissected frame by frame. The phone rang. It was Robert again. "She gave an exclusive interview to 60 Minutes, he informed without preamble. "It airs Sunday." Edward closed his eyes, feeling exhaustion overtake him. What more can she say that she hasn't already said? "Apparently, a lot," Robert replied gravely. "Sources at the network say she has proof of her accusations." Edward frowned. "What proof?" "There's nothing to prove something that never happened. I don't know, but be prepared. This is going to get worse before it gets better." After hanging up, Edward remained motionless for a few minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what they'd faced. Outside, the reporters finally withdrew, promising to return at dawn. The Alcott mansion, once a symbol of success and wealth, had now become the epicenter of a media scandal that threatened to destroy everything he had built. With heavy steps, Edward went up the stairs and stopped before Louisa's room. He opened the door silently and watched his daughter sleeping, her face finally at peace. He promised himself that, no matter what happened, he would protect that child from all the madness Deborah had unleashed. In the hallway, he paused before the empty space where Helen's portrait once hung. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would find the fragments and restore it. It was time to stop running from the past and face the present, however painful it might be. Outside, the storm was finally subsiding, but Edward knew the worst was yet to come. Deborah's revenge had only just begun, and he needed to be prepared for the battle that was looming. Deborah's interview for 60 Minutes was exactly what Edward and his lawyers feared: a meticulously constructed piece of emotional manipulation. For 20 minutes, she narrated her distorted version of events, presenting herself as a dedicated wife who had desperately tried to bond with her stepdaughter, only to be cruelly rejected by Edward, supposedly still obsessed with Helen's memory. The proof mentioned by Robert turned out to be edited text messages and partial audio recordings, presented out of context to support the narrative of emotional abuse. The reporter, known for her incisive approach, did not question the evident inconsistencies in Deborah's account. The morning after the broadcast, the Alcott mansion was once again besieged by journalists. The shares of Edward's companies plummeted on the stock market. Business partners began to distance themselves, and even old friends called to check in, a polite way of asking if the accusations were true. "We need a counter-offensive," Robert argued during an emergency meeting in Edward's office. "Your silence is being interpreted as guilt." Edward remained calm, watching the reporters jostling at the property gates through the window. "I will not turn my private life into a public spectacle," he finally replied. "I will not expose my daughter to further trauma." Dr. Laurel, who was attending the meeting via video conference, intervened. "I agree that a media war would be counterproductive, Edward. But we need some strategy to re-establish the truth." At that moment, Louisa appeared at the office door. She had spent the morning helping Lucy catalogue the damage Deborah had caused to the house: broken vases, torn documents, Helen's personal items that had mysteriously disappeared. "Dad," she called timidly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Edward signaled for the others to wait and followed his daughter into the hallway. "What is it, Princess?" Louisa hesitated, nervously adjusting the hem of her t-shirt. "Why don't we show them the truth?" she finally asked, pointing towards the reporters outside. "What do you mean?" "People are believing Deborah's lies because that's what they're seeing," the girl explained, with surprising logic for her 10 years. "If we show them the truth, maybe they'll believe us." Edward knelt to be at his daughter's eye level. "And how do you suggest we do that, Princess?" Louisa thought for a moment. "Remember when Mum always said actions speak louder than words? We can show the truth without having to say anything." Back in the office, Edward shared his daughter's idea with the lawyers and Robert. At first, there was skepticism. "It's too risky," Dr. Davies opined. "Anything you do will be analyzed and possibly distorted." "Not necessarily," Dr. Laurel countered thoughtfully. "If it's something genuine and undeniable, ... Double quotes Robert, who until then had been silently observing the discussion, suddenly brightened. "The daisies," he said, looking at Edward. "What about them?" Louisa mentioned that Deborah destroyed the solarium daisies, right? Helen's favorite flowers? Robert stood up, pacing back and forth. What if you simply planted new daisies together in the garden? Something simple, genuine, that naturally refutes the abuse narrative. The idea quickly took shape. No announcements, no interviews, just father and daughter performing a meaningful activity together, in full view of the reporters who hadn't left the gates. It wouldn't be a direct answer to the accusations, Dr. Laurel pondered, but it would eloquently demonstrate your true relationship. Edward consulted Louisa, who loved the idea. Immediately, they called the local nursery, requesting daisy seedlings for delivery the next day. Meanwhile, on another front, Dr. Davies achieved an important victory. He managed to get an independent expert to analyze the original video posted by Deborah. The initial results already indicated digital manipulation in several sections, including cuts and audio overlays. The next morning, as planned, the nursery truck delivered dozens of daisy seedlings. The reporters, eager for any movement on the property, immediately pointed cameras and microphones at the vehicle. At 10 o'clock, Edward and Louisa went out into the garden. They wore simple clothes, he, jeans, and a light t-shirt. She, denim overalls, and yellow rubber boots that Helen had given her for her last Christmas. They carried gardening tools and the daisy seedlings. Flashes fired frantically. Reporters shouted questions, but father and daughter simply ignored the commotion and headed to a flower bed near the solarium, visible from the gates. In silence, they began to work. Edward dug small holes, while Louisa carefully positioned the seedlings. Her hands, still bearing marks from the cuts caused by the glass shards, moved delicately through the dark soil. "Like this, Princess?" Edward asked, loud enough for the most powerful microphones to pick up. "No, Dad," Louisa replied with a patient smile. "Mum always said the roots need to be well covered, remember?" Edward smiled, accepting his daughter's guidance. "Your mother was the gardening expert, not me." "Show me how it's done," Louisa demonstrated, her small hands guiding her father's to firm the seedling into the soil. There was a touching naturalness in the interaction, a genuineness impossible to stage. The reporters watched in silence now, some lowering their cameras, others exchanging confused glances. The scene before them directly contradicted the image of the abusive father painted by Deborah. For over an hour, Edward and Louisa worked side by side, planting row after row of white daisies. They conversed in low voices, occasionally laughing when he made a mistake that she promptly corrected. At one point, Louisa lost her balance and almost fell backward. Edward immediately steadied her, holding her carefully. When she recovered, he delicately removed a bit of dirt that had smudged her face. "Just like your mother," he commented, kissing her forehead. Helen also always came back from the garden with dirt on her face. The cameras captured everything. The genuine affection, the attentive care, the evident connection between father and daughter. When they finished planting the last seedling, Edward lifted Louisa into his arms so she could admire the completed work. Rows of white daisies, like small earthly stars, now adorned the flower bed that Helen had loved so much. "She would have loved it, wouldn't she, Dad?" Louisa asked, resting her head on her father's shoulder. "Yes, Princess, she would have loved it." Without another word, they returned to the house, leaving behind a renewed garden and dozens of journalists in reflective silence. That afternoon, the story took an unexpected turn. Instead of the sensationalist headlines of previous days, the main newscasts showed images of the father and daughter planting daisies together. Without narration, without heavy editing, just the pure scene, letting viewers draw their own conclusions. Online, the garden video quickly went viral, now competing with Deborah's in number of views. Commentators began to question the veracity of the ex-stepmother's accusations. Neighbors of the Elcott mansion gave spontaneous interviews, reporting how Edward had always been a dedicated father and how Deborah, not he, exhibited controlling behavior. Lucy, after consulting Edward, also decided to speak with dignity and firmness. The housekeeper, who had served the family for over 20 years, described what she had witnessed in the few months Deborah had lived in the mansion: the cold treatment of Louisa, the gradual removal of objects that reminded them of Helen, the small cruelties disguised as discipline. John, the gardener, who came twice a week, confirmed Louisa's account of the destruction of the daisies. The girl's private tutor commented on how her behavior had drastically changed after Deborah's arrival, becoming withdrawn and fearful, in contrast to the vibrant child she had known before. 3 days after the garden scene, Dr. Davis received the expert's definitive report. Deborah's original video had been extensively manipulated. Audio from different conversations was overlaid, segments were cut and rearranged, and even facial expressions were digitally altered to appear more dramatic. Armed with this evidence, Edward's lawyers filed a defamation lawsuit and requested a public retraction. Deborah's reaction was explosive. In a live social media broadcast, she attacked Edward, the experts, the neighbors, and especially Lucy, whom she accused of blind subservience to her employer. But her words, once received as shocking truths, now met with skepticism. The contrast between her erratic behavior and Edward's silent dignity did not go unnoticed. "She's self-destructing," Laurel commented over the phone. "The more she talks, the more she contradicts herself." A week after the scandal began, the tide had completely turned. The shares of Edward's companies recovered, business partners reapproached, and the press, once so eager to exploit the case, began to retreat. On Friday afternoon, the last group of reporters finally left the gates of the Alcott mansion. In the garden, the newly planted daisies swayed gently in the mountain breeze. Edward found Louisa in the solarium, where she was quietly drawing. On the table, the fragments of Helen's destroyed portrait were carefully organized like puzzle pieces. "What are you doing, Princess?" he asked, sitting beside her. Louisa showed him the drawing. It was a representation of the destroyed photo, made with colored pencils and surprising precision for her age. "I'm trying to remember what it looked like, so we can fix it," she explained. Edward examined the fragments. The frame's glass was shattered, the photographic paper torn, but Helen's smile was still recognizable in the pieces. "You know what?" he said, carefully picking up one of the fragments. "I think we can do better than this." That night, after Louisa fell asleep, Edward searched the basement for a box he hadn't opened in months. Inside, he found the original negative of the destroyed photograph, the one that used to be in Louisa's room, showing Helen in her solarium, surrounded by her beloved daisies. The next morning, while his daughter was still asleep, Edward drove to New York City. At a specialized photography studio, he handed over the negative and requested not just a reproduction, but a special enlargement. When he returned to Aspen Grove at the end of the day, he carried with him the perfectly restored portrait, framed in light wood, exactly like the original. Louisa was ecstatic. Together, they hung the portrait in its rightful place, in the girl's room. But Edward had another surprise. He led his daughter to the mansion's main living room and showed her a prepared space on the most prominent wall in the house. "I think your mother deserves a place of prominence, not just in your room, but throughout the house," he explained, as he hung a second enlarged copy of the same portrait, "so that everyone who enters here knows that Helen is still a part of this family." That night, for the first time since Helen's passing, father and daughter dined at the main table, with her portrait serenely watching them from the wall. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, like a family embrace after a long time apart. Outside, the newly planted daisies glowed under the moonlight of the Blue Ridge Mountains, like small sentinels guarding the Alcots against the shadows that tried to divide them. 3 months passed since the media storm unleashed by Deborah, with the experts' report confirming the video manipulation and the testimonies of employees and neighbors corroborating Edward and Louisa's version. The case quickly disappeared from the news, replaced by new scandals and controversies. The divorce proceedings advanced without major obstacles. Deborah, realizing that her public attack strategy had failed, opted for a more pragmatic approach, focusing on securing substantial financial compensation. Edward, eager to definitively close that chapter of his life, agreed to a generous settlement, on the condition that she sign a confidentiality agreement and commit to never again approaching the mansion or Louisa. At the Allcourt mansion, life gradually found a new rhythm. Edward completely reorganized his professional agenda, delegating responsibilities and reducing travel to be more present in his daughter's daily life. Robert, promoted to executive director, took over many of the duties that previously consumed Edward's time. "Are you sure about this?" Robert asked during a lunch in New York City. "You built this empire with your own hands, don't you miss it?" Edward watched the frantic movement of Fifth Avenue through the restaurant window, so distant from the tranquility of his home in Aspen Grove. "The empire will still be there," he finally replied, "but Louisa will only be a child once. I've already lost too much time." At home, the changes were evident. The office, once an inviolable sanctuary where Edward isolated himself for hours, now always remained with its door open. On the walls, alongside diplomas and certifications, photos of Louisa and Helen shared space with the girls' most recent drawings. On Saturday mornings, it had become a ritual for father and daughter to prepare breakfast together. Edward was still a disaster in the kitchen. The eggs, always overcooked, the toast invariably burned, but Louisa didn't seem to mind. On the contrary, her laughter at her father's clumsy attempts filled the house with a joy that had long been absent. "Mum used to say you were a lost cause in the kitchen," Louisa commented one morning as they tried to save charred pancakes. Edward laughed, throwing the darkened batter into the trash. "She was right, but at least I'm trying, aren't I?" Louisa nodded, a gentle smile lighting up her face. Slowly the girl was returning to the vibrant child she had been before. At school, her teachers noticed the change. She participated more, smiled more, made friends. The child therapist Edward had hired to help her process the recent traumas reported extraordinary progress. "She's an extremely resilient girl," Dr. Silver explained during a follow-up session with Edward. "And do you know what the most important factor for that resilience is? You, Edward. Your constant presence, your unconditional support. In the garden, the daisies planted on that fateful day bloomed abundantly, forming a white carpet that stood out against the green vegetation. Louisa had developed a genuine interest in gardening, spending hours alongside John, the gardener, learning about different plants and cultivation techniques. Just like her mother, John often commented, observing the girl's dedication. "Mrs. Helen would be proud. On a particularly pleasant spring afternoon, Edward found Louisa in the solarium, focused on a new project, a small bed of violets, Helen's second favorite flowers. "I thought we could have different flowers for different times of the year," she explained, noticing her father watching. "Daisies are for summer, but violets bloom in spring." Edward sat beside her, helping her transfer a small seedling to a decorated pot. "It's a wonderful idea, Princess. A garden that changes with the seasons, just as we change with time." Louisa raised her eyes, a serious expression on her childlike face. "Dad, do you think Mum sees us from somewhere?" The question caught Edward off guard. Since Helen's passing, he had avoided discussions about spirituality or an afterlife. Uncertain about his own beliefs and fearful of feeding false hopes in his daughter. "I'm not sure, Princess," he answered honestly, "but I'd like to think so. That she somehow watches over us, even if she's not physically here." Louisa seemed satisfied with the answer and turned her attention back to the violets. "Sometimes, when I'm in the garden, I feel like she's right here with me, you know. I don't see her or hear her, but I feel her." Edward nodded, perfectly understanding the feeling. He himself had experienced that inexplicable presence walking through the solarium, watching the sunset from the viewpoint Helen loved, or simply contemplating Louisa's smile, so similar to her mother's. That night, after Louisa fell asleep, Edward sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, contemplating the stars that dotted the mountain sky. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Robert, informing him that Deborah had finally signed all the divorce documents. Officially, that chapter was closed. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness, not for the loss of the marriage, which he now recognized had been a mistake from the beginning, but for the lost time, for the traumas that could have been avoided had he been more careful, more present. His thoughts were interrupted by a small noise. Turning, he saw Louisa standing at the balcony door, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Can't sleep, Princess." She shook her head, walking over to him and settling into his lap, as she used to when she was younger. "I had a dream about Mum," she said softly. "She was in the garden, tending to the daisies, and she told me to tell you that everything is all right now." Edward felt emotion close his throat. He hugged his daughter tighter, unable to respond immediately. "It was just a dream, Dad," Louisa continued. "But it felt so real, ... The best dreams always do," he finally managed to say, kissing the top of his daughter's head. "And you know what? Your mother is right. Everything is all right now." They stayed like that for some time, watching the stars in comfortable silence. Edward realized that, for the first time in a long time, the pain of losing Helen would never completely disappear, nor should it. It was part of the love they shared. But now that pain coexisted with a new joy, a new purpose found in the rebuilt relationship with his daughter. The next day, Edward surprised Louisa with a proposal. "What do you think about going to Elephant's Peak viewpoint? It was your mother's favorite place to watch the sunset." The girl's eyes sparkled with excitement. Although the Alcott mansion was in Aspen Grove, they rarely enjoyed the city's tourist spots. Edward was always too busy, and after Helen's passing, the places she loved became too painful to visit. They left in the middle of the afternoon, taking a small picnic basket prepared by Lucy. Edward drove slowly along the winding road up the hill, pointing out to Louisa the spectacular city views that unfolded with each turn. At the top, they found a quiet spot, away from the few tourists visiting the viewpoint that weekday. They spread a blanket on the grass and sat down, contemplating the horizon where the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Mum and I used to come here before you were born, Edward recounted. We would spend hours talking about the future, about the family we wanted to build. Louisa listened attentively, absorbing every word about the mother she had lost too soon. When we knew you were on the way, Helen insisted on coming here to introduce you to the mountains, he continued, smiling at the memory. She said, you needed to know the view, even before opening your eyes to the world, and you brought me here after I was born, Louisa asked. Many times when you were a baby, then ... Quotes. Edward hesitated. Then business became more demanding, trips more frequent, and we ended up coming less and less. A shadow of sadness crossed his face. So many things I should have done differently, he murmured, more to himself than to his daughter. Louisa took her father's hand, her small fingers intertwining with his. Don't be sad, Dad. We're here now, aren't we? Edward smiled, marveling at his daughter's simple wisdom. Yes, Princess. We're here now. That's what matters. They watched in silence as the sun set, painting the sky in dramatic shades of orange and red. The lights of Aspen Grove began to twinkle in the valley below, creating a magical spectacle of light and shadow. From his bag, Edward took out the restored portrait of Helen, the one Deborah had destroyed and that he had reproduced. It was a smaller copy, protected by a sturdy cover. I brought your mother with us, he explained, handing the photograph to Louisa. I thought she would like to see the sunset from her favorite place again. Louisa held the portrait with reverence, positioning it so that the last ray of sun touched Helen's smiling face. Look, Dad, she exclaimed softly. The sun is kissing her. Edward felt his eyes well up. But it wasn't a painful sadness. It was a sweet emotion, a longing he could now express without feeling shattered inside. When the sun finally disappeared and the first stars began to dot the sky, father and daughter gathered their things and returned to the car. On the way back to the mansion, Louisa fell asleep in the passenger seat, Helen's portrait held securely in her hands. Edward drove slowly, savoring the moment, aware that life was made of these small fragments of time, some painful, others sublime, all equally important in building who we are. Upon arriving home, he carried a sleeping Louisa to her room. Carefully, he removed the portrait from her hands and placed it on the nightstand, beside the small dried daisy the girl had kept from that terrible day in the solarium, now a symbol not of destruction, but of resilience and hope. Good night, Princess, he whispered, kissing his daughter's forehead. In the hallway, he paused for a moment before the larger portrait of Helen on the main wall. Her serene smile seemed different now, not a painful reminder of what had been lost, but a gentle reminder of what they still had. Thank you, Edward murmured to the photograph. For her, for everything. In the days that followed, the routine at the Alcott mansion gained new colors. Louisa's piano lessons, abandoned after Helen's passing, resumed. Edward reorganized his home office, creating a space where his daughter could study while he worked. On Sundays, they became regular visitors to the craft fair in downtown Aspen Grove, where Louisa discovered a talent for ceramic painting. And in the garden, the daisies continued to bloom, more vigorous each day, as if nature itself applauded the family rebuilding among its white petals. One morning, as they had coffee on the balcony, Lucy brought the local newspaper. On the front page, a small note informed that Deborah Maxwell had left the United States, apparently moving to the United Kingdom after finalizing her divorce. Do you think she'll ever come back, Dad? Louisa asked, who had peeked at the news over her father's shoulder. Edward folded the newspaper carefully, setting it aside. "I don't know, Princess, but if she does, we'll be ready, together." Louisa smiled, satisfied with the answer. She turned her attention back to the drawing she was making, a colorful representation of the mansion, with daisies everywhere and 3 figures in the garden, a large one, a small one, and a third, more ethereal one, hovering over them like a guardian angel. Edward observed the drawing with contained emotion. In a few childlike strokes, Louisa had perfectly captured what they had become, a family that, even incomplete, remained united by bonds that neither a departure nor malice could break. "It's beautiful, Princess," he praised. "Can we hang it next to Mum's portrait?" Louisa's eyes shone with pride. "I can make a special one for that," she offered, already separating her best-colored pens. "One that matches her frame." As Louisa concentrated on her new masterpiece, Edward observed the blooming garden, thinking about how life could be simultaneously fragile and resilient, like daisies that survive storms, like photographs that can be restored after being torn, like hearts that, even broken, continue to beat and eventually to heal. "Dad," Louisa called, "remember when you promised to teach me how to cook?" Edward laughed. "I don't know if I'm the best person for that, considering my limited culinary skills." "It doesn't matter," she insisted. "We can learn together." That afternoon, the Alcott Mansion kitchen transformed into a culinary battlefield. Flowers scattered on the floor, cake batter splattered on the walls, and in the center of the chaos, father and daughter laughing until tears streamed as they tried to decipher a chocolate cake recipe that Helen used to make. The result was disastrous. The cake collapsed in the center and burned at the edges, but neither of them seemed to mind. Sitting on the kitchen floor, they ate the imperfect cake directly from the pan, sharing stories and plans for the future. "Next time it'll be better," Louisa assured, her face smeared with chocolate. "Next time," Edward agreed, marveling at his daughter's resilience, at her ability to always look forward, even after everything they had been through. On the living room wall, Helen's portrait seemed to smile more intensely, as if approving of that scene of domestic joy. Beside it, a space awaited Louisa's new drawing, another piece in the mosaic of memories they continued to build, day after day, rebuilding not just a house, but a home. Outside, the white daisies swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, like small white sentinels guarding the silent promise father and daughter had made to each other, to remain, to remember, to rebuild, and, above all, to bloom, even after the storm. End of story, dear listeners. We hope the story of the Alcott family has touched your heart. Edward and Louisa's journey reminds us that, even in the most difficult situations, truth and sincere love always find their way. To continue your journey through equally moving narratives, we have prepared a special playlist with stories that explore family bonds and overcoming adversity. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If this story evoked emotions in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day, we bring original stories that explore the complexity of human relationships. And you, have you ever experienced a situation where the truth needed to bloom despite adversity? Tell us in the comments. Your experience can inspire other listeners facing similar challenges. Until the next story.